Great Lives is a download from Radio 4. We hope you enjoy what you're about to hear. For this week's Great Lives, I want to take you back to 1992, the 31st of October, when Pope John Paul II, 350 years after our subject's death, gave an address on behalf of the Catholic Church in which he admitted that errors had been made by theological advisers in the case of Galileo Galilei. He declared the Galileo case closed, but he did not admit that the Church was wrong to convict the Italian physicist, mathematician and astronomer on the charge of heresy because of his belief that the Earth rotates around the Sun. And my guest, who's chosen him, presents this programme with a first. The first on Great Lives to have named his son after the person he's championing, or second name of the son anyway. Let me introduce a guest who, on the face of it, couldn't be more removed from 16th century Catholic Italy. A DJ, radio and TV presenter, Bobby Friction, currently presenting a radio show every afternoon on BBC Asian Network and, well, why don't I just read his own self-description on his website? Welcome to the virtual home of Bobby Friction, DJ, presenter, journalist, broadcaster and Jedi Knight of Desi music. For 20 years, Bobby has been in the eye of the storm of South Asian music, playing the role of chairman of the board, cheerleader and fanboy, all rolled into one. He's played a pivotal role in the emergence of Desi music worldwide, and this site is where his brain lives. And now to the main point. Why Galileo?
Why Galileo? Well, as a DJ, as a musician, I didn't know anything about Galileo apart from Freddie Mercury screaming out the words Galileo in Bohemian Rhapsody. And that was kind of it until I turned 30 and picked up an Arthur C. Clarke book and started reading science fiction. But then through reading science fiction, I started to realise science fiction is a great entry point into the world of science per se.
Do you think that you were unconsciously looking for a hero and happened to find him in science, or were you unconsciously wanting to know more about science?
I think it was unconsciously wanting to know more about science. I'd kind of blanked out the fact that I had a microscope at the age of 5, that I was collecting butterflies at the age of 6. I mean, this is all rather weird activity for a London boy growing up in the 80s. And essentially, I think subconsciously, I rediscovered science and rediscovered a passion I had that I'd forgotten about, because you don't do things like that if you're in the music industry.
And you named, was it your second son, Galileo as his second name?
Not my second son. I have twins. They turned 1 a couple of weeks ago, a boy and a girl. And yeah, he managed to end up with the name Galileo. His first name's Zorava, which is a very ancient Sikh name, Zorro for short. And I mean, he's going to hate me for this, obviously.
Galileo Galilei, born on the 15th of February 1564 in Pisa, Italy. Let's now bring into the discussion Dr. David Berman, a reader in theoretical physics at Queen Mary, University of London. David, tell us a little more about the very beginnings of Galileo's life.
Well, there's an interesting connection here with Bobby, because Galileo's father was actually a musician. And also he was a musician that was challenging the sort of view about what music was at the time, and actually wrote a dialogue discussing different views of music theory. So Galileo sort of grew up in this environment surrounded by music and questioning, but it was also a poor environment. He wasn't a very wealthy man. And at the time, you know, you had all these difficulties. So he was one of 7 children, and you had to marry those 4 daughters off, and so finding a dowry for those was very difficult for the family. The other sons, Galileo's brother, was not particularly wealthy or successful. So Galileo definitely felt that a lot of the weight of the family was on him and him doing well.
I find it very interesting that his dad wasn't just a musician. Do you feel that, in a way, his father's obsession with theory and proving music almost mathematically in a way actually influenced Galileo? Because I think there's definitely a connect going on there.
Oh, enormously. And it wasn't just the theoretical questioning, because a lot of this was about the idea of music theory came also from the Greeks. It was the same sort of Greek philosophers that were determining what physics was with the same people determining what music was. And as they challenged music, and also interestingly, he tested it, and Galileo's father tested those ideas, and Galileo was around witnessing that and being excited by that and seeing that there was method that you could apply to how you investigate the world.
The origins of his defiance are interesting too, because the first big defiance of his life was defying his father, who wanted him to study medicine.
Yes.
And he went on as he continued, rebellious.
Well, yeah, I think this is one of these sort of standard things. All parents want their children to become doctors if they're from a certain set of
My
family.
father's exact words, you're going to become a doctor. Yes. A surgeon's better than a GP. and my rebellion started in exactly the same way.
Yes.
Sorry, carry on.
No, well, absolutely. And of course, you know, he went there, he studied medicine, but eventually you go your own way, and he knew that maths and physics was the way forward for him. And eventually, you see, he was good at it. And in the end, all parents want is that their children succeed. So once he became good at it and money was forthcoming, I think the objections of the parents soon dissipated.
Same with you, Bobby?
Exactly the same. My dad's actually got a degree in pure maths. And my dad was obsessed with me being great at maths, then going into the sciences. And it wasn't until I came home one day and said, Dad, I just got offered a job presenting on Radio 1. And he flipped overnight from, my son does nothing, my son's trying to start in music, and just went, this is amazing, my son, the Radio 1 DJ.
I'd like to get a picture of the young man, how he looked, what sort of appearance, how he spoke, the impression that he gave. We've got in front of us a couple of portraits of him, looking kind of bearded, slightly wild-eyed and distinctly sceptical. Give us an idea, if we have an idea, David, of the impression that this young man made.
I think what's clear is that he was very charismatic. He was someone who could talk to important people and impress them. He was someone who could teach well. He taught not just the students in Padua, but he taught privately. He taught the duchesses and dukes of Florentine Italy. He was really, top of his game at explaining and communicating to people. So he's clearly a man with charisma.
Did he court popularity, do you think?
Absolutely. But it was also, I think, almost a political thing for him. When he wrote, he enjoyed writing even in regional dialects. He wanted, because he was aware from being at university, that there were people there who were interested, educated, who would then have to move on and do other things and not have access to some sort of rarefied discussions that took place in Latin. So he wrote for them. He wrote the dialogues in common Italian or even in some sort of regional dialect so that those people would have access to things. There's a quote which I just love, which he was asked, don't people need shepherds? He said, well, people only need shepherds if you're in a jungle and you can't see the way. If you can just illuminate the way and everything is clear, people can see for themselves.
A man of the people.
I feel a real connect with what you've just said, and a real connect with Galileo there. I came here today to talk about Galileo and the Inquisition, but you talking about him as a young man, and especially with this ability to communicate, that's my job. It's what I do.
It's kind of what he did with the universe, isn't it, Galileo?
And it was not just that he wanted to explain to people. He really wanted to change the way in which they viewed the world.
I wanted to ask you about that because he was not just a mathematician, although he was always a mathematician and started as a mathematician, but he became a scientist too, and his methodology was quite new.
Yeah. Arguments which were based on things called thought experiments that you didn't have to do but could just imagine, dismantled 2,000 years of Greek thought. And that was just in terms of theory. But then he understood the notion of experiment and the fact that experiment could be approximate to the truth. So it wasn't that something was right or wrong, but you could just somehow get some inquiry, some method of seeing how close something was right or wrong. And so he was a brilliantly skilled lens maker, brilliant instrument maker, and he built these things and then took care and did the observations himself and was a brilliant observer.
Impossible, perhaps, to do in 2 or 3 sentences, but you say he dismantled 2,000 years of Greek thought. Can you Can you characterise Greek thought? Can you characterise the kind of science that he dismantled?
Well, I mean, when we talk about Greek thought, we really mean Aristotle. And so much of that was built around the idea of absolutes. The idea, for example, that the moon was a perfectly round sphere, that the sun was perfectly round, smooth. Everything was in perfect spheres. Some things were perfectly fixed, like the Earth. Other things moved according to certain motions that were all meant to be in perfect circles. And then when Galileo came along and looked at things with a telescope, even the moon, he saw had mountains on them.
And he measured them.
And he measured them. Yeah. And he was, in fact, incredibly close. This was a shock, because it was no longer these perfect spheres in the sky. It was dirty stuff, bumpy things. It was more real and gritty. And it didn't worry Galileo that it didn't follow some perfect sphere. It's how it was. And so he was very good at looking at something and saying, well, look, you can have all of the great ideas in philosophy you like. If you measure it and it doesn't match, it doesn't match.
As a youth, did you hear the story that Galileo was supposed to have climbed up the Leaning Tower of Pisa and dropped two objects from the top? Is it true?
I remember a story of an Italian moving up the Leaning Tower of Pisa. In terms of Galileo, I think that's a bit of an exaggeration.
Did he do it at all, David?
It was actually pendulums, if I'm right.
The claim is that he himself didn't do it. I think the people who did it were the people trying to disprove him.
Yeah.
And they wrote, and this again comes back to the approximation, they wrote and said, I did this. I dropped stuff off the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and, they didn't land exactly at the same time. There was some discrepancy, some small discrepancy. And Galileo said, well, look, my theory said they should arrive at the same time. There's a small discrepancy. Aristotle said they should arrive many seconds after each other.
So I'm
who's more right?
Yeah.
And this was the point, that he would accept that some things couldn't be precisely right because he knew that there was friction and he knew there was things that would dilute things as an experimentalist. But can I just say one story, because I love it, is that when that experiment was done in the purest way possible, which is where you had to remove air resistance, was done on the moon. 1971.
Wow.
An astronaut came and he went, here I am, and I've got a hammer and a feather, and he dropped them and they landed in perfect synchronicity.
There you go, on the moon. What a beautiful story.
What was the reaction when Galileo started to question the Aristotelian view of not just the world, but of the universe?
Well, not surprisingly, the church was not pleased. They'd already burnt at the stake Giordano Bruno some 10 years before Galileo published his work. And so, yes, they were unhappy. Now, but you see, Galileo was a clever man. It wasn't just that he was a good scientist, as we discussed. He was quite a clever politician. So he knew the Pope. He knew the sort of cardinals involved, and he sort of negotiated a middle way that allowed him to still continue his work. Although the Inquisition said, you're not allowed to say that Copernicus is right. You are allowed to discuss it.
You mentioned Copernicus. People often forget, they think that Galileo was the first person to think that the Earth went round the sun. Well, it was Copernicus.
It was Copernicus. And, most of the issues Galileo had were in terms of I wouldn't call it the religious establishment, because as we know, he actually courted them a bit, with the philosophical establishment were actually around Copernican ideas more than anything else.
Such an unusual man. He never married, but he lived with a woman all his life. He had a son and two daughters. Both his daughters went into nunneries. And there was one particular favourite. She was christened Virginia, but she became Sister Marie Celeste. And he had this really moving correspondence through much of the later part of his life with this daughter. And I thought I'd read her letter out to him, just to bring out the human side of this scientist. This is from Marie Celeste. Most illustrious Lord Father, I cannot rest any longer without news, both for the infinite love I bear you, and also for fear lest the sudden cold, which in general disagrees with you so much, should have caused a return to your usual pains and other complaints. I therefore send the man who takes this letter purposely to hear how you are, and also when you expect to set out on your journey. I've been extremely busy at the dinner napkins. They're nearly finished, but as I have no cell of my own to sleep in, Sister Diamanta kindly allows me to share hers, depriving herself of the company of her own sister for my sake. But the room is so bitterly cold that my head is infected. I do not know how I shall remain well, unless you can help me by sending me a set of those white bed hangings, which you will not want now. I'd be glad to know if you can do me this service. Moreover, I beg you to be so kind as to send me that book of yours which has just been published, so that I may read it, for I have a great desire to see it. And she goes on about cakes that she's made for him and cakes that she'll be sending to him, and she hopes they'll reach him before the cakes get too dry. And finally, she says, with all my heart, I greet you in the name of me and Sister Arcangela. From San Mateo, the 21st of November, 1623, your most affectionate daughter, Sister Maria Celeste Galilei. And she ends the letter at the end with a kind of P.S. If you have collars to whiten, you can send them. It's sweet.
He was obviously a lovely father, you know, especially in those times. I don't think you would have written a letter like that to a stern father who's, you know, removed from you mentally and spiritually.
And so fond of him, worrying about his cold. And then, as an afterthought, perhaps I could have a look at your book as well. You're listening to Great Lives, where my guest, DJ Bobby Friction, is talking about his hero Galileo, with the help of our expert, Dr. David Berman. So far we've established Galileo's passion for mathematics, pioneer of the whole idea of experiments, his work on motion, which had led him to making enemies amongst the Aristotelians. Now, explain to us a little more, David, about the Dutch invention that in the end took him to the assertions that caused his downfall.
So the telescope had just been invented in Holland, and he became aware of this. And what was good is that he immediately saw its use. He saw its use for investigating the heavens and then testing a lot of these ideas about how the cosmos worked. And in particular, testing the Copernican idea that we go around the sun rather than the old idea that the Earth is the centre of the universe and everything moves around that.
Yeah, which the Catholic Church based on the fact that in the Bible they refer to the sun going down in various places, so they must have thought the sun was moving.
Well, it's also, you know, it's something that we can very easily take for granted today and find amusing. But if you think about it, it's quite a weird idea that the Earth is moving, because we don't feel it.
No.
And we do look up and we see the sun rise and go. It seems actually a perfectly sensible point of view. One of the things that's very important is not just that he could test the motion of the Earth and see things, particularly, for example, Venus going around the sun. He also got a feeling of the size of the universe a little bit. We forget in these days of light pollution in cities that there is the Milky Way, which is this amazing streak across the sky. When Galileo looked up, he could see that perhaps the Milky Way was actually all made of stars. That must have been amazing, to see that the universe was so much bigger than was before.
Was he the first person to think the Milky Way was made up of stars?
I believe so, yes. So there's some notion where he could, because of the telescope, see all of the things and put the place of man in the cosmos, which was much, much smaller than the Church wanted it to be. For example, there were spots on the moon. There were moons around Jupiter. All of these things he could see with the telescope.
Do you think, Bobby, that Galileo realised at the outset not only how revolutionary his ideas were, of course he must have, but also what enormous and violent resistance he was going to get?
I think he did, and I think that's why he turned into this consummate politician. I think that's why he turned into this man we're still talking about, and not a man who was burnt at the stake.
The book which we've been talking about was published in 1632, but as you've said, it took a while for the Church to realise that the ideas were catching on and therefore needed to be hit hard on the head.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of a bit complicated. Before the book came out, he was working on it for quite a few years, and the Church had already censored Copernicanism. They'd said, you know, you can't say it's right. You can discuss it, but you can't say it's right. So he wrote the book under that censor. He asked for permission. He knew the people involved, but he was in constant discussion with them about this book. By the way, this dialogue form that he'd done before. He realised it was very accessible to the general populace. And I also wanted to say it was the time when we already had the printing press. So books could be mass-produced and actually reach people. And, this dialogue book was a bestseller. He was sort of like the Stephen Hawking of the day, and this was The Brief History of Time. And so I think one of the problems that the church had was perhaps the success of the book.
The way he actually interacted with the church, the way he interacted with the people of Europe at the time, I think is something that really stands out for me, because the younger me would have believed in this stereotype, which is Galileo was this angry, intelligent rock star of a scientist who said, okay, I've discovered this and you're all going to follow me, and come on, church, let's go toe to toe. He wasn't that at all. No. And now the older me, who's not a rebel in the same way I used to be, appreciates the fact that he was a consummate politician. He realised the way to change the world, the way to change the way people thought, was to have a dialogue.
And then, there were some internal political issues within the church, I think, which Galileo got caught up in. And he'd made enemies along the way. It's impossible to be that successful and not make enemies along the way. It was these people that then sort of pushed and said, maybe this book has gone a bit too far.
But he was friends with the Pope. Why didn't the Pope stick up for him?
Oh, so he was friends with Urban VII, who was the Pope who was around the time when he started the book in the original censor. But by then he'd died, and we had Urban VIII, and he did know Galileo and had discussed with Galileo, but the Pope was in a sort of difficult position. He had cardinals pushing for various things.
How unlike our own day.
Yes. You probably know better than I, Matthew, how these things work. But yes, it was a complicated political situation.
Tell me about his trial and recantation.
He was brought before the Inquisition, and he was actually prosecuted for going against the papal order to teach. So there was a whole discussion about whether this order had ever been given, in fact. And it seemed like there was a very complicated thing gone on before. So the trial was not as clear-cut as people first imagine. Yeah. It was not necessarily saying you are a heretic for doing this. It was that you had gone against the papal order.
Yes.
And that was much more, that suited them better. In the end, though, there's no doubt that there were lots of things going on behind the scenes which was going to determine the outcome.
I think my problem with the trial and this recantation that you talk about is the fact that when I first realised he was a hero of mine, it was all based on the fact that, okay, he had to deal with this trial and he recanted in the end. And then, folklore suggests that he muttered, and yet it moves. He was talking about the earth. Yeah. Upon further reading, a lot of people have actually said, well, he didn't say that. That was actually done 100 years later. Someone else said it, and basically it can't be proved. And I think that's the one thing that's stopping him from becoming almost godlike in my head. Because if he didn't recant, that would have been the ultimate two-fingered salute, rock and roll kind of utterance. Brilliant. Obviously, you don't want to die, so you're just going to mutter something, and the scribes of the day will pick up on it. They're saying he didn't say that. So I do have a problem with him right at the end, and that is he was a politician. He did actually, oil the wheels of all his relationships, but at the end, he didn't stand up strong as a man.
Yeah, but maybe, Bobby, that's because he was only interested in science and in the truth, and he had no personal pride, or personal pride wasn't what drove him. And he realised that his ideas were out there, that he had proved them, that he'd won the argument. And so if for a quiet life he just had to shut up, is that the wrong decision?
Right. And even 10 years ago, I would have gone, no, that's entirely wrong.
Be burnt at the stake.
Be burnt at the stake. Be burnt at the stake. Die flying a flag and we'll love you. But no, actually, as you get older, you realise being a great man sometimes isn't about being obstinate and being passionate all the time. It's actually about doing the best with what you have.
Yeah.
And in fact, he wasn't burnt at the stake and lived a relatively comfortable life under a kind of house arrest.
Yes, he just went under house arrest. And I wouldn't say comfortable life because by then he was really quite ill. He suffered from all sorts of ailments. and in fact went blind as well. And so his last few years after the trial were not particularly comfortable because of this. But it wasn't because of the persecution of the church per se, just that, he was reaching into his 70s around that time. And, life was not easy in those days. Can I just say, there was nothing to be gained by him going, yes, please burn me at the stake. What's great about an argument and about science is that once those things were out, the church could not put them back into the bag.
What was the public reaction, so far as we know, to his trial and condemnation? Outcry?
No. One has very little record of outcry, and indeed, by the time he died and was buried, he was not buried in the family tomb, but in a much more obscure part, because he was still deemed to be someone accused of heresy. So the public didn't support him openly, at least. But, by then, his book had travelled throughout the whole of Europe, so even what had gone on in Italy didn't matter. It had made it all the way around the world.
How long, David, till his views became the received wisdom?
I think they were among a certain elite, intellectual elite of Europe. They were immediately accepted. During his time, he was communicating with Kepler and other scientists at the time around. Kepler was in Czechoslovakia, he was communicating with people in France, and so these ideas were then propagating during his lifetime and became quite well accepted.
There is actually a difference between your two points of view. You, Bobby, I think, especially admire the courage, the heroism, and the personal intellectual independence with which he stood up to the received wisdom and the church in his day. You, David, I think, of course, acknowledge that he was right and early about which heavenly body went round which, but you think that it was as an observational scientist that his really great contribution was made.
As I say, it's the method. He gave birth to the idea of what science was, how we combine theory and experiment and live according to that. And that's his amazing contribution.
And your little boy, Bobby, Zorro Galileo, have you any ambitions for him? Do you want him to be a surgeon or another astronomer?
He's definitely getting a microscope and then a telescope and any science-based toys he needs from a very early age.
My thanks to Bobby Friction, who championed the great life of Galileo, and to our expert witness, David Berman. Goodbye. Thank you for downloading this programme from Radio 4. There are some 250 other editions of Great Lives available on the Radio 4 website.